Welcome back. Just Stop Oil caused hours of delays earlier when they blocked the M25 at several junctions. That is after police launched a significant operation to identify and arrest the climate change activists before they could stage their protests. Well, it seems emotions were running pretty high above the M25.
The International Energy, the IPCC. How many more people have to say, we don't have a livable future if you continue licensing oil and gas for you to listen?
Well, a great deal of emotion, obviously, as you can see. And joining me to discuss it, former Met Police Detective Peter Bleksley. Thanks for coming, Peter. And Sam Johnson, spokesperson from Just Stop Oil. Well, Just Stop Oil have vowed to protest every day till Christmas. And I wonder whether this is the way to get people on side or not. Let's start with you, Sam, obviously, because you represent Just Stop Oil. What is the purpose of this? I can see the emotion. People get the gist of it. But, God, this is going to cause absolute hell and mayhem, isn't it?
Hi, Vanessa. Thank you for having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Look, I'm a bloke from Essex. I've worked in construction most of my life, and I find myself, like everybody else, in this truly crazy situation. Your viewers deserve to know that this disruption will end as soon as the government makes a statement that it will end all new oil and gas licences.
Right, at the moment, we've got the Prime Minister literally just finished speaking at COP27. There is a likelihood that he might not go. He is there. Boris Johnson's also there. The Prime Minister's shown a great deal of commitment, hasn't he, to taking your message very seriously. So you've got the Prime Minister at COP27 essentially espousing your message and saying that he's going to put power, money, effort and everything else behind it. Why do you need to be sabotaging commuters on the M25 at the same time?
I think people have COP fatigue. COP's started today, it's COP27. That's 27 years of failed, broken promises. Last year, the take-home statement was, when the UK hosted COP, was it's code red for humanity. If you're on a submarine and it goes code red, the Admiral doesn't sit down and go, I think I might have a crumpet. They act. Our government is failing to act. It's continually failing to act. And that's why young people on gantries on the M25, because they have no other choice. It's that serious. And the government is not taking it seriously. What should we do, Vanessa? What should we do?
All right. But, I mean, you talk about COP fatigue, which is a very real thing. I've been talking about it all the way through the show. I've said, does anyone care about it? Is anyone interested in it? Do we think last year did anything? What about the year before? I mean, COP fatigue, valid. It's certainly a thing. I mean, many people listening and watching this who don't feel that, though. They hope that it's really going to make a difference. But another very real thing, surely, is Just Stop Oil fatigue, Extinction Rebellion fatigue, disruption fatigue, being absolutely damn fed up, especially at a time when the non-railway strike seems to have caused absolute havoc and nobody can find a train and the stations are closed, that your chaps and girls are getting in the way of their lives. They're just trying to live, make a living, get on with life.
Well, that fatigue would disappear immediately as soon as the government acts. Today, the head of the UN said, we're on a highway to climate hell with a foot on the accelerator.
Right.
So I'll repeat that. So what do you think we're on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator? What do you think that means to the people in Britain?
I think it means a lot. I think it's scary and frightening. I think it means that people think that something or other has to happen. I'm just not sure it's that. Let's ask Peter Bleksley. You're a former police officer of considerable renown. Do you accept what your fellow guest has to say, which is that these guys and gals have no choice? What else are they meant to do? There's nothing else available to them apart from this kind of activism.
I can't condone breaking the law, especially when I hear a story today of a consultant surgeon held in a traffic jam for many hours as a result of Just Stop Oil's protests and therefore unable to see his cancer patients. I also witnessed some of the impact of the demonstration today because I was on the A2 close to the M25 and I saw miles and miles of lorries and cars sitting there, travelling extremely slowly, engines idling, burning more oil, I would imagine, than if they were functioning properly at 60, 70 miles an hour on a motorway that was moving. Rishi Sunak, just minutes ago, spoke about a common cause to tackle climate change. Millions of people around the world will have heard him just speaking literally minutes ago. That is the way to influence, to campaign, to lobby, not disrupting the movement, the economy and the well-being of the common man.
That was basically blah, blah, blah from a man who didn't even want to be at that. He was forced to go there.
By whom?
By public pressure, basically.
But if public pressure, though, even if you're right, and he was forced by public pressure, doesn't that mean the message is majorly getting through? The public is putting the right kind of peaceful pressure, so are fellow MPs, on the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is there, Boris Johnson is there, we are involved, and the right kind of action is going to be taken.
We're in the position because nothing else has worked. That's why we're here. I'd like to ask Peter. He says he respects the law, but the UK government has broken its own climate laws. That's much more serious than people going out and breaking laws, as so you say. I'd like to ask you, how serious do you think climate breakdown, societal collapse is to law and order in the UK? Is it the greatest threat we face now?
Well, I'm not a climate skeptic. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm really not the person to direct that question towards. But I sense there is a change that we've seen over the weekend in terms of your protests. We already know that your communications have clearly been compromised because there was a leak, a national newspaper got hold of it.
Yes.
The police have been taking actions before the protests, including arrests. So I would say to you, please be careful, because your phones might be tapped now, your emails might be hacked, and there is undoubtedly spies within. In fact, I've got a question for you. Are you actually an undercover police officer that's infiltrated Just Stop Oil?
Well, you'd know that, wouldn't you? Basically, what we need to do, and this is a serious thing, we need to stop talking about the what's, about what we're doing. We know we're disrupting. This is high-level disruption, and we know that. And we don't want to be doing it. It's awful.
What do you want?
We want to talk about the why. Say, with that young woman, Louise, why is she up there?
Okay, we know why she's up there, but what do you want? What do you want?
We need change. We need to stop all new oil and gas licences. That's what the International Energy Agency is saying. That's what the UN is saying. That's what the IPCC report says. The last line on the IPCC report says this. It says, we have a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future.
That's pretty much the message from COP26,
can we have
isn't it?
Can we have a show of show of hands here? Who could live in an unlivable future?
Well, none of us, obviously.
I'll
tell you what we'll do. Let's bring in Professor Colin Davis. Now, Professor Colin Davis is from the University of Bristol, and he's joining us because it's quite interesting, I think, to talk about the psychology of climate change. Prof, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. What do we even mean when we say the psychology of climate change? It's either changing or it's not. Where does psychology come into it?
Well, I mean, ultimately, climate change is driven by human behaviour. And if we want to do something about climate change, we need to change human behaviour. And there's a lot of psychology involved in protest, because what protesters are doing is trying to influence the government via the public. So that's a form of communication that psychologists are interested in.
And so what will be the net effect if it carries on as it was?
Well, you know, I mean, we hear a lot about the supposed counterproductive effects of protesters, but it's very interesting to listen to debates like that between Peter and Sam. I can see both sides of what they're saying. On the one hand, the public does find it very annoying when protesters block roads and throw soup and so on. It makes people less sympathetic to the protesters. But on the other hand, the reason that protesters do that is that they know that these are tactics that will generate media attention, whereas more moderate tactics, like marches and rallies, don't get any attention at all. So there's a trade-off between getting your demands heard and retaining public sympathy. And so for groups like Just Stop Oil, getting the demands heard is what's really most important. And what the research shows that we've done at Bristol University is that people really do clearly distinguish between their attitudes towards the protesters themselves and their tactics versus how they feel about the cause and their demands. And people often say, I agree with what you're saying, I just don't like the way you're going about it. That does seem to be the message. That's what we find in our research, looking not only at climate change protests, but also Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, abortion rights protests in Poland. People make that distinction. Yes, they do shoot the messenger to some extent, But nevertheless, they do still hear the message.
So thank you very much for that. Let's bring in climate activist Sam Knights. He's in London Bridge. Hello, Sam.
Hello.
OK, so you've listened to all our different contributors so far. How about your perspective on all of this?
Well, Sam's absolutely right, and the protesters with Just Stop Oil are doing a fantastic service for not only this country, but for people all around the world. I mean, if we look at protest and successful protests across the ages and the various social movements that have caused these successful protests and have caused eventual real policy societal change, we'll see that disruption is inevitable, right? Like Rosa Parks caused traffic jams. And with history books, history does not always remember the people going, oh, that's a shame that there was a traffic jam that day, right? This is what change looks like in the moment. And what we've seen through the last couple of years in Britain has been effective social movements taking action. So let's look at the school strikes. Let's look at Extinction Rebellion in 2019, opening up that moment for change. There is a reason that in 2019, the UK was the country in Europe whose climate anxiety was most heightened, whose concern for the climate was most heightened, and that was because of these type of strikes. There's a reason that we got the net zero commitment, that we got the Green New Deal from the Labour Party, that it led to real legislative change, and that's because we've had disruptive protests. And so Just Stop Oil is exactly right in asking for that now. We're talking about COP27, the things that Rishi Sunak is announcing today in the last couple of minutes. Well, do you know when they were promised? In 2009, that financing was promised. That's 13 years ago. 13 years ago, the United Kingdom said to developing countries, look, we are going to pay you some money, and we broke that promise year after year after year after year. In COP26, we made sure that it wasn't even on the agenda, right? This pressure, it needs to be kept up. And anyone telling you that we are doing enough is quite frankly lying to you. That this couldn't be more clear. I mean, it's one of those kind of things that, honestly, if you told it as a morality tale for children, people would go, oh, maybe this is a bit on the nose. The world's top scientists are telling us that we need system change in order to avert the complete destruction of life on Earth. And we have a choice. And the choice is whether to act, to be on the side of protesters, to be on the side of disruption, or to do nothing.
All right. I mean, you're very passionate. You're very eloquent. There'll be many people who agree with every word, others who don't, but still think you stated your case admirably and in a very inspirational kind of a way. But let me go back to Peter. I mean, when you hear somebody like Sam talk in that way, he really does, I think, put a very convincing case for the notion that there is no other way. It's only this way. This is the way. And he mentioned Rosa Parks. Normally, his compadres mention the suffragettes. And both times it has exactly the same kind of emotional effect. People think, oh, yes, actually, they did do something disruptive. It did achieve change. This is the right way. It's the only way it can work. Do you think that it is working? I mean, is it worth all this disruption if the change, the right kind of change is brought about?
Well, Justice Chamberlain in the High Court, who issued the injunction, clearly thinks that it's not suitable, appropriate, and that it is, in fact, unlawful. And now I would just add, as a word of warning, because I've pored over that injunction in great detail, it does cover encouraging others to breach that is actually an offence. You can be arrested, imprisoned, fined potentially for contempt of that court order. And now, once again, I will say to Just Stop Oil, your security has been compromised. You are as leaky as a leaky bucket. So be very, very careful.
And I'll bring this Sam back in.
Well, yeah,
here.
thank you. Well, yeah, Peter's gone with the scare tactic, but there's nothing that the police or the government can do that's worse than what's actually what we're living in. My sister was released from court today with an ankle tag. Some of you may remember her. She was the ginger girl that was said, I'm doing this for my son at the start of October.
Yeah, I think we do remember.
Yeah, she's quite infamous. She has an ankle tag. She can't go to London just for peacefully demonstrating.
But was it peaceful or was it disruptive?
Well, she was flying. You saw her flying. And then it's all about she's peacefully disrupting. There's no.
I mean, is that a thing? Peaceful protest means you stand there or you march or you sit, doesn't it? It doesn't mean that you stop people doing what they're meant to be doing. You interfere with daily lives. You cause absolute havoc, build up of traffic going back miles and miles and hours and hours. That's not peaceful protest, is it?
that is peaceful. You have to look at.
Well, how is that peaceful? That's affecting the peace.
It's
affecting people's right to do what they want to do. It's not standing on the side of the road with placards on the M25,
but
that's
ineffective. And under British law, we are allowed to use proportionality.
Let's just bring the professor back into this if he's still there. Prof, one of the facets of all of this seems to be that Just Stop Oil, Extinction Rebellion and all the other activists seem to think that they're party to a level of information and a level of urgency and almost righteousness, I think, that the rest of us, or those who are not chaining ourselves to the railings or gluing ourselves to a Monet, don't understand, that they have a kind of superior understanding that we can only kind of gaze at in awe because we don't quite achieve it. Is that what it is?
Well, certainly groups like Just Stop Oil are stressing the urgency of the situation. But then, as Sam mentioned earlier, so is the United Nations and climate scientists. I think sometimes we play up the difference between activists and the public too much. Certainly, they differ with respect to what they themselves personally are prepared to do. But the majority of the UK public is very concerned about climate change, agrees there's a climate emergency. Most people in the UK in polls agree that governments are not acting fast enough, particularly with the cost of living crisis. They want to see a transition away from increasingly expensive oil and gas towards cheaper, clean energy. So, I think these protests are effective to the extent that they get people thinking about, well, why are people still protesting about this? Why isn't it happening? And they question perhaps the government's strategy of continuing to
all right, Prof, thank you very much. I think I might give the final word just tonight to Sam Knights because, he's good at final words, I think. He's good at first words as well. Let me give you the chance to sum this one up. Give me a couple of lines on this and then we'll bid you farewell, Sam.
Well, I think it's always interesting how we frame the debate, right? And so often we're talking about the disruption that climate activists cause. And so little we're talking about what the police are doing, the ways that they are disrupting our life. And we know that the recent police bill has been a massive crackdown on protest. I myself have been called as a danger to national security by the police, right? As banned from taking part in the Labour Party conference, taking a part in normal democratic politics, because seemingly to be a young person who cares about climate change, you have to be ostracised from the conversation. We know today there have been preemptive arrests made. We know that previously the police have unlawfully banned Extinction Rebellion protests. And what I would say to people in authority, in charge right now, is to think about what happens when you suppress peaceful protests to this stage. What happens is violent protest, and none of us want to see that.
All right,
so why don't we start talking about peaceful protest as an important part of democracy?
Bleksley, so you hear what he's saying, and you hear what your fellow guest is saying. What's your final verdict on this, Peter?
I have two sons at university. I spend a lot of time with bright young people, and they're great. Bright young people who feel they are entitled are a tiresome bore.
Thank you very much indeed to Peter Bleksley, to Sam Johnson, Sam Knight and the Professor coming up on the programme. We were about